Well, there are lots of indications that there's still racism in American society. If we look at overall indicators for life chances, life expectancy, income, wealth, educational attainment, and performance within schools, we still see discernible differences in performance between whites and Asians and blacks and Latinos in the United States. Some of those differences are attributed to systemic or structural factors, and to the extent that we can explain those differences by systemic and structural factors, and we can, that is evidence of racism in American society. In addition, while we don't see a lot of the racial violence that we saw a century ago, we still see examples of overt racial violence in the United States today. For instance, the Southern Poverty Law Center has just released a report that indicates that there is a lot of racial violence in the South directed towards Latinos under the guise of xenophobia and anti-immigration stances. And so when we see these things happening, when we see news incidences on the rise in 2007 towards African Americans, we can still say that there is still bigotry, racism, and prejudice in American society. Well, it indicates tremendous progress. It demonstrates the power and influence of the African American vote. And it's remarkable that African Americans have been able to exercise their political influence such a way 40 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, now 44 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. It is a testament to the increasing tolerance of non-black communities and putting their faith and confidence in someone like Barack Obama to be their president of the United States. If we look at other candidacies for the presidency, for instance, Jesse Jackson's Democratic candidacies in 1984, 1988, people were not prepared to elect an African American president at that time. So the fact that Obama was able to make it past the nomination stage and to win the presidency shows tremendous racial progress in this country. A post-racial society, should we ever get there, would be a society where when social scientists like me run our models and we include race as a dummy variable, race is no longer statistically significant. And we're just not there yet. So anytime we run a model, we see significant differences in some of the indicators that I mentioned before: education, income, life expectancy, probability of going to jail, other types of things. And once those things are no longer being predicted by race, then we can say that we're in a post-racial society. But until then, people's race still is actually very significant in their lives. And as an aside for the president, most people argue that his race wasn't a hindrance to him, and in fact it may have been a help to him. Racism and racial stereotyping cut both ways. It can cut in negative ways and it can cut in positive ways. And so in many ways, President Obama represented the exception that proved the rule. That still reifies the notion of race in our society, and it still reifies negative stereotypes towards African Americans. And while it makes us feel good, and it may make us feel progressive or liberal or cosmopolitan, there's still some underlying racial prejudice that goes into the attitude, and we need to be very mindful of that. I think as post-racialism is being constructed in popular media today, I think it does actually have the potential to water down diversity and helps to obscure the need to appreciate people's diversity. Oftentimes people bandied the term post-racialism during the last election as a shortcut to be able to not deal with persistent racism in American society. I actually wrote about this in the Washington Post and got attacked for it. So people could say, I voted for Barack Obama, therefore I am not prejudiced. I voted for Barack Obama, therefore there's no racism in American society anymore. You know, one historic election, while important and while pivotal, is not necessarily a sign that we have completely turned the corner, and we always have to be vigilant about our own prejudices, our own attitudes, and this goes for minorities and non-minorities alike, to be able to be on our guard to recognize that we're all capable of slipping back into old patterns of action. If we declare 2009 the post-racial age in America, we end up sort of failing to recognize that we are all still human and that we are all still very susceptible to a lot of really bad attitudes towards other groups. Black leadership today, looking at the people who have been dubbed post-racial leaders in American society, people like President Obama, people like Governor Deval Patrick, or Mayor Cory Booker, or Adrian Fenty, or Congressman Archer Davis, or Harold Ford, owe a debt of gratitude to the African-American forebears who came before them, who were not always welcome in mainstream political circles, who were perceived as being racialized, who were often defined in direct opposition to this young cadre of leadership. And most of them do recognize that they owe a debt of gratitude to the trailblazing steps that those forefathers and foremothers made for them. In terms of the current electoral system in which many young Black politicians are running, they do really seek out alliances with Latinos in their communities. And so we know in this past election that one of the things that helped Barack Obama in his quest for the presidency was increased Democratic voting amongst Latinos. And so for the previous two election cycles, we had seen Latinos identifying increasingly with the Republican Party in terms of their vote. We saw that tide switch, and it was actually going back to more normal historic levels of voting behavior amongst Latinos. There are a lot of cities where there are Blacks and Latinos who live side by side and where both groups make up a significant portion of the population. And you do need Latino support in order to create a multiracial coalition that puts Blacks in office. So to that extent, yes. There are some cities where you don't see Blacks and Latinos living in the same space or in the same political jurisdiction. And so those alliances are less salient in those races, but in most races you do need a broad multiracial coalition, and that certainly includes Latinos. I study African-American leadership. I'm particularly interested in questions of generational transition amongst African Americans. So I'm interested in Black politicians born after 1960. What are the implications for having been born after the Civil Rights Movement, having been a beneficiary of the Civil Rights Movement in terms of being able to run for political office and being able to change the landscape of what we usually consider an African-American political agenda. So this has led to me editing one book coming out later this year called Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Black Leadership. And I just received a contract for my book that focuses on Newark, New Jersey, called Newark and the Clash of Two Black Americas. With respect or relating to these issues, I am interested in the intersection of race and class in particular, and looking at class-based politics. So usually we think about African-American politics in terms of its political unity. So we look at the fact that 90% of African-Americans usually vote Democratic in presidential elections. That was 95% in 2008. And we look at partisan identification in the African-American community being about 80% Democratic. And so people assume that Blacks are a monolithic political group. We've always known that that wasn't true, but there are generally forces such as discrimination and racism that have compelled African Americans to close ranks politically. So my questions tend to ask, well, what happens within this Democratic coalition when you have African Americans who represent different political agendas, who represent different political eras, and who very explicitly represent different types of class politics? What's the impact on what we think of as that classic African American political agenda, where we're talking about reducing inequality, addressing poverty, how to address poverty, and what ways to frame that. And so there's definitely a generational battle within African American communities over these issues, and there's been this long-standing discussion about the efficacy of adopting what we would call deracialized politics in political science, but what I think most journalists are calling post-racial politics. So the politics of racial transcendence, not necessarily making explicit racial appeals to African American communities. There are lots of people who are very concerned that when candidates do not talk about race on the campaign trail, that they are hamstrung from being able to address race in a very forceful and explicit way once they're in office. Now that we have a critical mass of quote-unquote post-racial young Black political leaders who have used these deracialized strategies to get into office, we now are going to be in a position to be able to test whether or not they are effective in their office, whether they are more effective than their Black predecessors, and whether or not we can actually advance that classic African-American political agenda going forward.